Welcome to Karen's Conversations number 10. I'm very happy and pleased to be joined by a friend and industry colleague, Matt Hoopers. So without any ado, I'm going to throw straight to Matt to get him to do an introduction of himself, and then we'll talk about the topic. Welcome.
Hi, Karen. Good to see you. Thank you for having me on.
So Matt, tell us a bit about yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So I've been in IT for a little over 20 years. Mostly grew up in the operations side of the house, network engineer, systems administrator. Started my career on the service desk, and then I went into the consulting space. Did some work in and around performance testing, performance engineering, leveraging my understanding of software development lifecycle and infrastructure to consult for really large institutions on how to make applications run faster. And during that kind of phase in my life, I dug deeper into the process side of the house. Typically, as you know, a lot of software is not written well when they don't have good requirements and they don't understand what they're trying to build and how to effectively test it. So did that for a number of years, and within the ITSM space, really focused mostly on service design and service transition type processes and activities, even though most of my background was on the service operations side of the house. And then for the past, I'd say probably 5 or 6 years, I've been more in helping people select ITSM tools and implement them. A ServiceNow partner for a number of years, and then CA, HP, BMC partners. And now I'm on the product side. I work for Landesk now, and my role is an ITSM evangelist. So a very unique role for me. I guess IT guy gone to the dark side of marketing, but it's fun. It's a really unique role. People ask, kind of what is an evangelist, and I don't know that my role inside of Landesk is typical for an evangelist. I think most evangelists are, the visionary, go out there and speak on behalf of what the product capabilities are. In my role, it really is more about leverage. How do we leverage technology to enable businesses? And so I haven't really had to change my pitch. That pitch works well internally for Landesk, leveraging technology to be more efficient and being a more digital business, which I do a lot of, and I do training and I enable SEs, and I have oversight on applications that we're deploying for our internal service management initiatives. But then I also go out to the industry and speak on the same kind of topic of how we can deploy technology faster but not introduce risk. And so it's fun ride so far. I've seen you twice this year. We saw each other in New Zealand, and then when I was in Australia. So it's been a unique experience for me to go out to different countries and talk about what digital business means and what ITSM's role is in enabling digital transformation. So it's been a great job so far, great experience. And I love the culture here at Landesk. A lot of fun.
Excellent. So that's talking about Australia and New Zealand. So in Australia, you did an excellent presentation I really enjoyed and learned a lot from, which I wanted to explore on this conversation. And that was entitled Accelerating Digital Transformation, Agile Service Management. So could you share what you mean by accelerating digital transformation?
Absolutely. So we have a situation happening inside of IT, who traditionally was the custodian over technology, right? Our role inside of IT was to be the developers, the operators, the enablers of technology within the enterprise. But on to the point that technology is so ubiquitous, so readily accessible, both in its device form, as well as in the applications and services that you can get, that businesses have gone out and gotten their own in a lot of ways. And this is now putting pressure on CIOs to understand their role in the digital transformation. The digital transformation for most businesses is really focusing on enabling better customer experiences. But for the most part, it's really focused on growth and revenue. And a big driver of that is usually digital marketing. We buy, for the most part, as consumers through the internet. We do our research and analysis through the internet. We find out and we get mostly advertised through the internet or through our mobile devices. And so that change and transformation where IT may have had a role in running the website for a corporation or maybe been involved a little bit in some of the digital marketing campaigns and strategies, they really weren't too involved in creating the customer experience. And now, as we look at any consumer, you could be in the healthcare space and how you look at your test results for a visit that you just had to your pharmacist or to your doctor, how you pick up your prescriptions at a pharmacy, how you interact with your policy for insurance and healthcare. That whole experience is almost 100% digital now. And the same thing goes for travel, insurance, how you do banking, even manufacturing and logistics. More and more businesses are employing 3D printers to do proof of concept, modeling, engineering, prototyping, and delivery. So there's this whole push for digital enablement within the enterprise and how that's going to be able to leverage that business into the new economy. And for the most part, CIOs are feeling like they're not being invited to the table, they're not part of the conversations, and what this has happened to bring about in our practice is a failure to understand the risks around security, disaster recovery, high availability, data contingencies, contracts negotiations. Because when buying and servicing technology, IT has learned a lot. And now they're not being invited to the conversation, and businesses are going out there and making these contracts or buying these technologies or getting this cloud operation, disaster recovery, service level agreements, high availability, security, data integrity, safe harbor European data laws, like where does the data exist and what the compliance and regulatory commitments are around where that data is stored. So they don't understand these things, and this is actually putting the business more at risk. So the dichotomy is you have IT that's slow and control and predictable, and then you have the business that wants to move fast and test new markets and figure out what's happening next. And some of these would have been called unicorn companies like Netflix and Amazon and Etsy, other things, that we're finding out that they're not so unicorn, right? That they are more stable plays that will show how businesses can move fast technically, but they need to change the way in which they evaluate requirements analysis, software development lifecycle, operation support, technology implementation, and readiness. So it's an interesting time to be in IT, but this challenge for CIOs pushes pressure down to IT to try to figure out how they can deliver services faster, better, and cheaper, right? We've always had that, but the pressure really is on because now where IT was a captive supplier, well, they're no longer a captive supplier. And if they act like a supplier, they're very quickly going to be on a panel of, well, should we keep this supplier or should we go to another supplier? The other supplier never really was an option, but now it's a legitimate option. Like Amazon is a legitimate option to get your storage, your compute, your power, and your operating systems, your networking, as opposed to your internal team, right? It's a legitimate, viable option where it puts a different pressure on IT.
Absolutely, it's like we've had many conversations saying all you need now is a browser and a credit card, and why would you need the traditional IT? And one of the questions you asked the audience at the conference was, how many of the people in the audience saw themselves as digital leaders? What was the response that you got? I mean, I was there, so I know, but you tell us.
You're giving me a softball here. I'm going to hit this out of the park. Well, so when I started off the conference, when I do this presentation, I typically ask, who considers themselves to be a digital transformational leader, and very few hands, if any, usually go up. And it's because in the ITSM realm, we have seen ourselves as a service provider. We see ourselves separate from the business. We call our business partners customers. We use terms and concepts that we interact with these business partners as a service provider. And what it's not really doing, it's not showing to the rest of the organization that we could be the trusted digital transformational leader. And there's a lot of things that we do in ITSM, particularly with the technology and our process approach, that actually is very transformative. You know, your whole book, which I got over here someplace, you know, the Balanced Diversity book here. If you haven't read it, you should read it. Awesome. Yes, awesome book, right? So we look at, you know, fulfillment versus innovation and the different quadrants and how we're approaching these things. You know, what it comes down to is that we are changing culture, we are changing behavior, we're influencing behavior through process, we're optimizing efficiencies through understanding the flow of work and where there are constraints and how things come into IT and how things get done. We also understand too about the enablement through self-service, self-knowledge, peer knowledge. So we're always putting out these innovative capabilities internally, but sometimes we don't take the approach that we really need to, which is to effectively market it. The question I usually ask is how many organizations run Google Analytics on their self-service system? Almost no hands go up. Mm-hmm. And if you were to ask a marketer, do you run analytics on your ad campaign, usage campaigns, and websites for user experience? They would look at you like you had two heads. They would say, how in the world could we possibly operate unless we knew what our users wanted to do and where they wanted to go? And IT doesn't take that approach always. I just saw on Twitter today, someone was saying, hey, how do we get users to, it was a cartoon, I think from ITSM Tools. They were saying, how do you get our users to use our self-service? And one person said, well, we should make it mobile. And another person said, well, we should make it interactive. And the third person said, well, maybe we should ask the users.
That's a bit radical.
Yeah, it's like a magic button, right? So, you know, when you look at that, what are we doing? And so in my presentation, I try to show the characteristics of traditional ITSM thinking. The thinking that, frankly, has done us a great deal in moving technology forward and moving ITSM forward. It has helped organizations bring in a predictability and a platform for how IT should operate. But at the same time, much like when you are putting controls in place on a vehicle or on a boat or any kind of in-motion type of system, controls will slow things down. And so what we have to look at is, okay, how do these controls enable us to move at high speeds, but can be applied, and the pressure can be applied in the right ways? And so I show traditional ITSM thinking versus kind of agile organization. So what I call agile service management, which I stole from ITSM Academy, because it is this new thinking that we want to have organizations who can respond quickly. And agile doesn't always mean fast, right? Agile might mean you move left or you move right. So we might not deploy technology faster, but we might shift from deploying it in-house to deploying it with a service provider or a cloud solution. And then that might increase our velocity over time. And so it really, the juxtaposition of traditional ITSM thinking versus agile service management thinking is pretty dominant right now in a lot of the organizations who realize that a fundamental piece of their business, the vital business functions, are enabled through digital strategies. And so when you look at that, are we doing things like creating B2B connectors for our asset management? When you look at most large organizations, sets up the fact that they're going to put an asset and make it readily available to their end users is usually not the person who registers that in the self-service, and they usually don't enable some kind of ordering process till later in the process development. And that's just a failure. So for instance, the webinar I did this morning, I kind of picked on the Note 7 from Samsung. Now, I'm a big Samsung fan. I don't mean to beat them up, but they've had a major hit here with the Note 7. Many corporate organizations offered the Note 7 as an asset to their end users. Now, what's it going to take for most of these enterprises to respond? Well, traditional ITSM, someone's going to have to go through an approval process, figure out how they're going to bring back the Note 7s, then give an order process for what they're going to replace it with. Is it the Samsung S7, how they order it, and how they deploy it? Whereas in an agile organization, organizations who have focused on a digital strategy say, No, we already have the systems in place. Our enterprise architecture is going to register the asset in the asset management database. That's going to automatically flag into our request portal. So when someone searches Note 7 replacement or mobile replacement, it shows, do you have a Note 7? And they hit yes, and it gives them instructions on how to replace their Note 7 with a Samsung S7 and automatically order it from their supplier. That experience when an enterprise is able to engage IT with such low friction and great utility, it then begs that business owner, when they're thinking about, hey, you know what? We have products that sometimes we have to pull back or replace, or we offer services that have shifted or changed or need to be enabled in a different way. How are we communicating to our end customers? IT's done such a good job for me. I'm not doing such a good job for my end customers. I should talk to IT about this. And that changes the disposition. A woman who I've had just incredible respect for since I've gotten to know her is Kim Stevenson. I follow her on all social media. She's now the COO of Intel. She was the CIO of Intel. And when she, in our video that we did together, my video interview with her in 2013, she talked about how she enabled kiosks for people to go up and just swipe their employee badge card to get computers and parts and things like that. This transcended into self-service and mobile interactions and request. She really focused on digital enablement strategies. In fact, there was a learning management system that her service management group had put together that was delivering content and streaming content on demand. And this streaming technology was so advanced that ultimately they actually spun out a division out of the IT group called Intel Streaming Media. Intel Streaming Media was bought for $4 billion by Verizon, right? No wonder she's COO. That's amazing, right? And so do you trust Kim with a digital transformation strategy? Absolutely, because she demonstrated with inside of IT. She made her IT organization an enabler of it. And she thoroughly marketed it. The reason why they had me come out to do the interview with her was to promote her annual IT performance report, where she talked about the performance of IT as a global organization and what they were doing for Intel as a business as a whole. And when she talked, she didn't sound like she was from IT. She would talk availability management. She wasn't talking about availability of systems. She was talking about availability of new features and the revenue that drove for Intel. Now, that's not the way we talk in IT. ITSM, we talk about availability like was a system up or down.
Yeah.
In the ubiquitousness of expectations, it's just availability management becomes something, a conversation that the business really doesn't want to have with us, because digital enablement is all about making sure the integrity of the business is sustained. So business should always be available, and if it's not, there's a real issue. Now, it doesn't mean that systems aren't going to fail. They are, right? Stuff breaks, that's life. But what are the conversations we're having to, okay, if a system failure happens, how does the business still operate, right? And the solutions that we're working with. And that's that partnership that we really need to get to with IT and the rest of our business partners, because IT is the business for many organizations today.
Absolutely, absolutely. And from my perspective, I think it's going to be a real uphill battle is probably the wrong word, but maybe an uphill struggle for a lot of organizations, because you mentioned that trusted partner. For IT to get that trust back, get to the table with the rest of the business is going to be a challenge. It's not going to be an easy task. I mean, one of the things you said in your presentation was, 68% of IT spending is now outside of IT. And that should be a real wake-up call for IT. It's like, what the? And how do we get back in line? And Matt, you talked about 5 areas of acceleration. So we've identified the issue and the challenge that's facing IT. So how do we accelerate that transformation? And you had 5 areas. The first one was knowledge. Can you briefly tell us what you mean by accelerating in terms of knowledge?
Yeah, absolutely. So knowledge is a great way to start to show the organization that we know how to interact with humans, right? Because many of the requests that come into IT are focused around knowledge. There's a question, there's a frequently asked question, there's a how-to, they're having an issue, or they want to connect to the Wi-Fi. And so when you look at the typical kind of response models in the traditional ITSM, we try to think of all these different heavy, documented processes and formatted, and the reviews that go through, and how we're editing and publishing articles, and where it's maintained on our network. And then if we juxtapose that to the typical consumer behavior, people Google things, right? We Google things, and we look at stuff like Wikipedia, where it's peer reviewed, it's peer managed, people are able to put comments on it. There's not a lot of heavy structure to it. So the agile organizations around knowledge management, they're accelerating the interactions using things like Standard and Case from Rob England. They're using KCS, which is allowing to elicit and maintain artifacts that are relevant and being voted up, kind of like Yelp. There's votes that go up, rankings on this piece of article, and then there's comments on it. This is helping to show that the knowledge itself is evolving, and the currency and effectiveness of knowledge floats to the top, and it does it in a digital manner, right? So they don't want to call the service desk. They don't want to email the service desk. They just want to search, right? They want to search easy and interact easy. So that's a big help, right? With knowledge, that accelerates that perspective, and that starts to build the trust with IT. Oh, hey, this is a really good solution, IT. We could probably use this in HR. We could probably use this in facilities, right? Or we could use this for our customer support center or our customer care. Hey, sales could probably use something like this, right? And then that becomes more pervasive. You start to demonstrate your ability to collect and share relevant information.
Yeah, and I think that's a real key point, is that, and you've touched on it a couple of times, the experience we have at home when we have an issue. I don't ring Apple. I Google, I Wikipedia, or I ask a peer. And we need to capture that knowledge. But we also need to give people that same experience in the workplace. And we just haven't seemed to have cottoned on to that. We just make it so hard. You have to ring, or you have to, search a knowledge base that's just out of date and not maintained. And that breaks that relationship and that trust again. So
right.
Yeah, some basic thinking. Two of the other areas of acceleration you talked about, and these are the ones that I think of interest, because people I talk to, practitioners and vendors, have said, this agile stuff, it's a real worry, because we have these change management and release and deployment management processes, and we're just going to totally break them if we go, agile. I mean, how are we going to cope? Making lots of changes very quickly. So how do we take change and release those processes that we've had in place probably for a long time, probably embedded in the organization, and then move them to transform them to a digital agile space?
Yeah, absolutely. Agile, and I've said this before, agile is probably one of those words that you can say, and depending on who you speak to, it could be completely opposite, right? You've got on one spectrum the people who say, okay, for us to be agile, it needs to be predictable, documented, rigorously analyzed, and verifiable, right? Because we need to know what we're doing, how we're doing it, and where we need to change. And the other one is agile, where we don't need to document anything. We're just going to throw it out there and test and try, and if it fails, we'll fail forward, right? And so the reality is this term agile has it's been used and abused probably in too many different ways, and hence the fear, because what we're talking about in agility and what we're talking about in DevOps and Agile ITSM is not so much the willingness to overlook effective controls. In fact, we want to find effective controls and then pursue them. What we are talking about is eliminating waste. And so when it comes to change management, and it comes to the failures of IT in project deployment and in release, what has happened traditionally is that because changes were breaking things, organizations would institute some kind of process governance framework. And in that governance framework, they may say, if they were, reviewing the guidance from ITIL, that they need a change advisory board. And their interpretation of that would be that this change advisory board was now the filter and control point to block bad things from happening to production. And so, like any kind of filter, it slows down the flow. So as the backlog of changes are coming into IT, this change advisory board, which was usually made up of people who really weren't that close to the actual functional risk that was associated with the change, would sit around and have to have conversations about what this change is, why did this change need to happen, what would the risks be associated with it. And at first, what they would start to see is that operations would start to stabilize and there would be less production issues. But at the same time, there would be a backlog of changes for new functionality or business requirements that wouldn't get through this change backlog. And since the change advisory board could only really review like the top really big issues, they would spend the 3 hours on a Thursday afternoon. For some reason, that seems to be like the most common time for change advisory board meetings. Probably because Friday and then the weekend, and they were making the changes during the weekend. They would go through really the only top 10 or top 15 or top 20 out of 70 or 100 changes. And the smaller changes, the low risk changes, the changes that really didn't need that much governance control, were way down the bottom of the list. And then after week 1, week 2, week 3 of not getting reviewed at all and not being given the go ahead, software developers and project managers would say, well, let's bundle these together to a larger change. So they now go to the top of the list to be reviewed. And then they'd be reviewed and then they'd get released, and then production issues would happen on the weekend and people would be called in and offices called in and over the weekend, and they're trying to fix things, right? And they're trying to get a hold of the developers to backlog it. Well, what this new thinking is in this kind of DevOps mentality is that by flowing this change process faster, by allowing smaller iterative changes to go in and being verifiable and happening during the day when everybody's available, is they could actually change production during the middle of the day with development and operations standing there together and having this flow of changes happening so fast that they could instantly verify if there was an issue and instantly roll back. And what has helped this significantly is now the change management and release management tools in a software-defined infrastructure. So in the past, a software developer would write code based on an environmental set of settings: the operating system, the network, the firewall, the web sphere, all the different environmental changes and settings would need to be in place for this code to work. But we required system administrations from the web sphere team and a network engineer from the network team and a systems engineer from the operating system changes to all work collaboratively to make those changes. For defined infrastructure, those can be all declared. So a software developer can put the changes they need for the software code and then actually control the infrastructure as code in one set of bundles. And we now have virtualization that can spin up the operating system, the network, the firewall, the load balancer, the virtual network, any kind of memory settings that need to happen, all within a set of specific code. So rolling that out becomes easier and rolling that back becomes easier because it's now programmatic. So what this new agile thinking is all helping us to do, and what study after study after study is telling us, is that DevOps is allowing us to flow work faster, but at smaller releases. Thus, the risk is lower, and the ability to roll back is easier and identify root cause is easier. Because as we know, when you bundle a whole series of complex changes, it's trying to unravel spaghetti. It's really, really hard to do. And thus finding root cause is almost impossible. So that's some of the new thinking that we have to learn to embrace. We need to understand is, okay, how can we flow things faster? So I try to give guidance in the fact that look at your change advisory board meetings and really analyze what is this team assessing and what should have been a standard of change, and what commitment are we making that every week we're going to push what types of changes to standard changes, or how are we going to measure the risk and impact of change and determine that certain teams have better capabilities and skills than others. Because let's be honest, certain teams have great developers or great understanding of infrastructure change incidents. So if they're never causing incidents, then they're really low risk. And their stuff, their changes just probably shouldn't be in front of the change advisory board, right? And that's going to free the cab up to be more strategic in its thinking, to focus more on the business impacting changes, or organizational change management, or the other things that frankly just never get the time to focus on, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And as you said, it's a change advisory board. It's never a change approval board, which is how it's been implemented in a lot of organizations. You don't go past us unless we approve it. We're supposed to be advisory about what we're supposed to be doing and not doing. And I think when I've had the conversations about DevOps and Agile, and people just going, it's chaotic, we can't do it. It's when we start talking about those tools and automation that the penny drops, and those smaller iterations, small changes, less risk, easier to back out if it fails or fail forward. And if you're, rolling up environments that are identical to production, then the risk is so low that those sort of changes can become your standard changes, because you're guaranteed that your integration has been proven before you put anything into a production environment, and you're deploying code on a daily basis. So that's when the sort of penny drops about this automation, and then we start talking about things like Chaos Monkey, and then the panic goes again. But it's, and a lot of it, like we've said for years, service management, a lot of it's common sense, but so is Agile. When you say smaller changes, less risk, easier to back out, well, yeah, of course it is, and some of the research by Puppet Labs is amazing. If people want to have a look, just Google it, and they've done some great research in terms of the difference between the Agile DevOps organizations and the traditional operations, and the degrees of failure is so less in the Agile organizations than it is in the traditional ones, which is fascinating, really. Actually.
Yeah. What's really interesting about that, Karen, too, is it's not just it's cool or that it's hip. This is a business imperative. Organizations like Netflix have heavy competitive pressure. They've got Sony, they've got Amazon, they've got Google, they've got Apple. They have competition on the heels of them from some major organizations in the world who have been in their space for much, much longer, who have a bigger bankroll and have more capabilities. So they have to stay agile. They have to stay competitive. And the theory behind Chaos Monkey is very simple. People think, well, that's insane. For those who don't know Chaos Monkey, it's a bit of code that goes into the infrastructure and shuts down databases or web servers or applications within the production systems. And you would think, why in the world would anybody do that? Well, Netflix has a policy that every piece of code and every piece of infrastructure should be built with redundancy. Chaos Monkey was coded very specifically to not shut down both instances of a web server, both instances of a database, both instances of a network. So if it shuts one down, things should still operate if it was architected correctly. And they only run it during the day between 9 and 5 when all engineers are on deck and all development teams are on deck and everybody's there that can rapidly respond to it. And they invest in monitoring, not as an afterthought, but as a pre-thought. They set up their monitoring infrastructure before they deploy new instances, right? To make sure that as they go live, things turn from red to green. And those are big fundamental differences in their approach and their strategy. Because they recognize the business imperative of it.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a brave new world, isn't it?
Yes.
Matt, it's been lovely talking to you. When are we going to see you down under again? Any in the near future?
Hopefully next year. I would love to come back. Kirsty McGowan and I are chatting about how I might be able to make another trip out and maybe attend another ITSMF event or speak down there. So I would love to see that happen.
That would be great. Thank you very much for your time, Matt. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thanks, Karen. Great to see you again.